A Karen tried to blind the royal guard with pepper spray, but his unshakable steel gaze left everyone stunned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. At 28 years old, he had served as one of the Queen's guards for nearly 5 years, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and occasionally tried to make him break character. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Thomas had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire where his grandfather had filled his childhood with stories of military honor and duty. His grandfather, a veteran of World War II, had taught him that true strength came not from physical power, but from mental discipline and unwavering focus. These lessons had served Thomas well during his military training, and now as he prepared for another day of ceremonial duty. The palace grounds were already bustling with early morning activity. Tour groups gathered near the gates, cameras ready, while palace staff moved efficiently through their daily routines. Thomas took his position outside the palace entrance, his rifle held at attention, his famous bearskin hat perfectly positioned. The weight of the ceremonial uniform was familiar now, almost comforting in its consistency. Margaret Pemberton had woken up that morning in her London hotel room with a sense of righteous indignation that had been building for weeks. At 53, she considered herself a defender of proper behavior and social order. Her friends back in Atlanta often joked that she could spot rudeness from a mile away, and Margaret took pride in that reputation. She had spent considerable money on this European vacation, and she expected everything to meet her exacting standards. The previous evening, Margaret had attended a tour of Westminster Abbey where she felt the guide had been insufficiently attentive to American visitors. At breakfast, the hotel staff had been slow to accommodate her request for specific dietary modifications. These small irritations had accumulated like storm clouds, and Margaret felt it was her duty to address what she saw as a declining standard of customer service. She had read online about the Queen's guards and their tradition of remaining motionless and silent during their duties. To Margaret, this seemed like the height of rudeness. How dare these soldiers ignore paying tourists who had traveled thousands of miles to visit? She had decided that someone needed to teach them proper manners, and she was just the person to do it. Armed with a small canister of pepper spray that she always carried for personal protection, Margaret set out for Buckingham Palace with a sense of mission. She had convinced herself that a little shock would teach these guards to show proper respect to visitors. In her mind, she was performing a public service. As Margaret approached the palace gates, she noticed the crowds of tourists already gathering. She observed Thomas standing at his post, his gaze fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring the people around him. This only reinforced her belief that these guards needed to be taught a lesson in courtesy. She spent several minutes watching his routine, noting how he never acknowledged the tourists taking pictures or asking questions. What Margaret failed to understand was the deep significance of the guard's duty. Thomas wasn't ignoring visitors out of rudeness, but out of respect for a tradition that dated back centuries. The Queen's Guard represented the unwavering protection of the monarchy, and their stillness symbolized their constant vigilance. Every moment of apparent inaction was actually a demonstration of extraordinary discipline and focus. Thomas, meanwhile, was acutely aware of his surroundings despite his motionless appearance. Years of training had taught him to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. He had noticed Margaret among the crowd, primarily because her behavior was different from typical tourists. While others took quick photos and moved on, she lingered, studying him with an intensity that felt more calculating than curious. The morning progressed with the usual rhythm of palace life. Tour groups came and went, children pointed excitedly at the colorful uniforms, and adults debated the historical significance of the changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas remained perfectly still through it all, his mind clear and focused, exactly as his training had taught him. Margaret grew increasingly frustrated as she watched Thomas maintain his position without acknowledging anyone. She began to mutter complaints to other tourists about the rude behavior of the guards. Most visitors simply smiled politely and moved away, but Margaret's agitation continued to build. She checked her pepper spray, making sure it was easily accessible in her purse. The irony of the situation was lost on Margaret. She was planning to assault a soldier whose job was to protect others, all because she misunderstood the nature of his duty. Her sense of entitlement had grown so strong that she believed her comfort as a tourist outweighed his responsibility as a guardian of one of Britain's most important institutions. As noon approached, Margaret made her decision. She would approach the guard and demand acknowledgement. If he continued to ignore her, she would use the pepper spray to teach him a lesson about proper customer service. In her mind, she was striking a blow for tourists everywhere who had been ignored by these ceremonial soldiers. Thomas sensed a change in the atmosphere around him. His peripheral vision caught Margaret moving with new purpose, and his training kicked into higher gear. Without moving his head or changing his expression, he became hyper-aware of every person in his immediate vicinity. Something was about to happen, and years of military discipline had prepared him for exactly this kind of moment. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Thomas had learned about duty, discipline, and the true meaning of strength. Margaret approached with her misguided sense of justice, completely unaware that she was about to face a level of mental fortitude that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about power and control. A Karen tried to blind the royal guard with pepper spray, but his unshakable steel gaze left. Everyone stunned. Margaret marched toward Thomas with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. Her designer shoes clicked against the stone pavement as she approached his position, pepper spray concealed but ready in her right hand. The midday sun was bright, casting sharp shadows that seemed to heighten the drama of the moment that was about to unfold. "Excuse me," Margaret said loudly, positioning herself directly in front of Thomas. "I'm talking to you, soldier." Her voice carried across the courtyard, causing nearby tourists to turn and watch. She waited for a response, her jaw tightening when Thomas maintained his perfectly still position, eyes focused straight ahead as if she didn't exist. Thomas was fully aware of Margaret's presence, but his training was absolute. The Queen's Guard did not break protocol for anyone, regardless of how demanding they became. He had encountered difficult tourists before, but something about Margaret's energy felt different, more volatile. Still, he remained motionless, trusting in his training and the security protocols that protected both the palace and the guards themselves. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Margaret announced to the growing crowd of onlookers. "This is completely unacceptable behavior. I've traveled 6,000 miles to visit this palace, and this guard won't even acknowledge my presence." Several tourists began filming with their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. Margaret's voice rose as her frustration peaked. "In America, we treat our customers with respect. We acknowledge people when they speak to us. This is just plain rude, and I won't stand for it." She stepped closer to Thomas, now just 2 feet away from his position. The pepper spray felt warm in her hand as she prepared to teach him what she considered a necessary lesson. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, yet it was over in seconds. Margaret raised the pepper spray and aimed it directly at Thomas's face. As she pressed the trigger, releasing a stream of chemical irritant toward his eyes, she expected to see him break, to flinch, to show some human reaction that would prove her point about proper customer service. But Thomas Mitchell was not an ordinary person. Years of military training, countless hours of meditation and mental conditioning, and an inner strength forged through genuine hardship had prepared him for this exact type of unexpected attack. As the pepper spray hit his face and eyes, something extraordinary happened that would be talked about for years to come. Instead of crying out, stumbling backward, or showing any sign of distress, Thomas remained absolutely motionless. The pepper spray streamed down his face, causing his eyes to water heavily, but his gaze never wavered. His expression remained completely neutral, as if nothing had happened at all. The only sign that he had been attacked was the visible moisture on his cheeks and the slight redness around his eyes. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people screamed, more in shock at what they were witnessing than in fear. Margaret stood frozen, the empty pepper spray canister still in her hand, staring in disbelief at Thomas's unwavering composure. She had expected immediate capitulation, dramatic reactions, possibly even medical assistance being called. Instead, she faced a man whose mental strength was so complete that a direct chemical attack had failed to break his concentration. Thomas's internal experience was far different from his external appearance. The pepper spray burned intensely, and every instinct screamed at him to react, to protect himself, to step away from the source of pain. But deeper than those instincts was something stronger, a commitment to duty that transcended physical discomfort, a mental discipline that had been tested and proven countless times before this moment. In his mind, Thomas drew upon the lessons his grandfather had taught him about enduring hardship with dignity. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had faced far worse in actual combat situations. He reminded himself that this was not about him personally, but about the honor of his position and the respect due to the institution he served. The pain became secondary to these larger principles. The crowd's reaction intensified as seconds ticked by, with Thomas showing no response to the attack. Tourists who had been casually taking photos suddenly found themselves witnessing something that challenged their understanding of human limitations. Some began applauding spontaneously, recognizing that they were seeing an extraordinary display of self-control and professional dedication. Margaret began to panic as she realized the gravity of what she had done. She had just committed assault against a member of the Queen's Guard in full view of dozens of witnesses, all of whom were now recording the incident. But more disturbing to her was Thomas's complete lack of reaction. In her worldview, everyone could be made to submit if enough pressure was applied. Thomas's unwavering composure shattered that belief entirely. "What's wrong with you?" Margaret screamed at Thomas, her voice cracking with frustration and growing fear. "Why aren't you reacting? This should hurt. You should be angry." She was beginning to understand that she had fundamentally miscalculated the situation, but her pride prevented her from backing down gracefully. Security personnel were now moving through the crowd toward the disturbance, but they approached cautiously, professional enough to recognize that Thomas had the situation under control despite being the victim of an attack. His continued perfect posture and unwavering gaze sent a clear message that no additional intervention was needed from him. Thomas could hear Margaret's increasingly desperate attempts to provoke a reaction, but they seemed to come from very far away. He had entered what athletes sometimes call the zone, a state of complete mental focus, where external distractions lose their power to disturb inner calm. The pepper spray continued to burn, but the sensation had become simply another piece of information rather than a source of suffering. Among the crowd, an elderly gentleman who had served in the military during the Falklands War began to explain to nearby tourists what they were witnessing. "That young man," he said with obvious respect, "is demonstrating the highest level of military bearing I've ever seen. What we're seeing is not just training, but genuine character under pressure." Margaret's confidence was crumbling rapidly. She had expected to humiliate the guard and prove a point about customer service. Instead, she had revealed her own lack of self-control while highlighting Thomas's extraordinary composure. The pepper spray canister slipped from her trembling hands and clattered on the stone pavement, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. As palace security finally reached the scene, Thomas remained exactly as he had been before the attack began. A living demonstration that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict pain, but from the capacity to endure it with dignity. The confrontation was far from over, but the fundamental dynamic had been established. Margaret had revealed herself as someone who resorted to violence when frustrated, while Thomas had shown himself to be unshakable in his commitment to duty and honor. A Karen tried to blind the Royal Guard with pepper spray, but his unshakable steel gaze left everyone stunned. The palace security team moved with practiced efficiency as they approached Margaret, who now stood paralyzed by the realization of what she had done. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police assigned to palace security, took the lead. She had seen many incidents over the years, but never anything quite like this combination of unprovoked assault and extraordinary professional composure. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the guard and place your hands where I can see them," Collins said in a calm but authoritative voice. Margaret looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route, but the crowd had formed a natural barrier around the scene. Every phone camera in the vicinity was pointed at her, recording her humiliation for posterity. Thomas remained motionless through the entire security response, even as medical personnel arrived to assess whether he needed treatment for the pepper spray exposure. The paradox was striking. He was simultaneously the victim of an assault and the most composed person at the scene. His unwavering gaze and perfect posture made him appear almost supernatural to the growing crowd of observers. "I want to speak to a manager," Margaret suddenly declared, her voice shrill with desperation. The absurdity of the statement drew nervous laughter from several tourists. Detective Inspector Collins exchanged a look with her colleagues, recognizing the behavior of someone who had never faced real consequences for their actions and was struggling to process this new reality. Dr. James Murphy, the palace medical officer who had rushed to the scene, approached Thomas carefully. "Guardsman Mitchell," he said quietly, "I need to check your eyes and respiratory system. You can maintain your position, but please blink twice if you're experiencing severe distress." Thomas blinked once, slowly and deliberately, indicating that he was managing the situation effectively. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people, creating an impromptu amphitheater around the drama. Tour guides from multiple companies had abandoned their planned routes to witness what was already being called an extraordinary display of military discipline. Social media posts about the incident were beginning to spread, with hashtags like Doc Unbreakable Guard and Doc Steel Gaze trending within minutes. Margaret was placed under arrest for assault on a public official, but her humiliation was far from complete. As the handcuffs clicked into place, she made one last, desperate attempt to justify her actions. "He was being rude," she protested. "In America, we don't treat customers this way. He deserved to be taught a lesson about proper service." An elderly woman in the crowd, who had been quietly observing the entire incident, stepped forward. "Young lady," she said in a crisp British accent, "that soldier's job is not to provide you with customer service. His job is to guard our queen with his life if necessary. What you've witnessed today is a man doing exactly what he swore to do, regardless of personal cost." The woman turned to address the broader crowd. "I've lived in London for 78 years, and I've never seen such a perfect example of duty and honor. This guard has shown us what it truly means to serve something greater than oneself." Her words drew spontaneous applause that continued for nearly a minute. As Margaret was led away, still protesting her innocence and demanding to speak to supervisors, Thomas finally received permission from his commanding officer to break his position for medical evaluation. Even then, his movements were controlled and precise. He walked to a nearby medical station with the same dignified bearing he had maintained throughout the assault. The medical examination revealed that while Thomas had been significantly affected by the pepper spray, his training in pain management and mental focus had allowed him to function normally despite considerable discomfort. Dr. Murphy was amazed by the guard's vital signs, which showed elevated stress markers but remained within normal operational ranges throughout the incident. In 30 years of emergency medicine, Dr. Murphy told his colleagues later, I've never seen someone maintain such complete physiological control while under chemical attack. His heart rate barely elevated, his breathing remained steady, and his muscle tension stayed constant. It's almost like he was able to separate his mind from his physical experience entirely. The incident video, captured from multiple angles by tourist phones, quickly went viral across social media platforms. The contrast between Margaret's escalating hysteria and Thomas's unshakable composure became a powerful symbol of grace under pressure. Military training academies around the world began using the footage as an example of ideal bearing under stress. Within hours, major news networks were covering the story. Military analysts praised Thomas's demonstration of what they called operational presence, while psychologists debated the mental techniques that allowed such extraordinary self-control. The incident became a case study in leadership programs and stress management courses. Margaret, meanwhile, faced charges that could result in significant prison time and deportation. Her travel insurance didn't cover criminal acts, and the legal fees for defending an assault case in a foreign country quickly mounted. The vacation she had planned to complain about online became a nightmare that would follow her for years. The Royal Guard's official response was characteristically understated. Colonel James Harrison, commanding officer of the Queen's Guard, issued a brief statement. Guardsman Mitchell performed his duties in accordance with the highest traditions of military service. His conduct reflects the values of discipline, honor, and dedication that define the Queen's Guard. Privately, however, military leaders were amazed by what they had witnessed. The incident became required viewing at Sandhurst Military Academy, where it was used to illustrate the difference between physical toughness and true mental strength. Thomas's ability to maintain his duties while under attack represented an ideal that most soldiers aspired to, but few achieved. For Thomas himself, the incident became a defining moment that crystallized everything his grandfather had tried to teach him about real strength. That evening, as he finally had a chance to reflect on the day's events, he realized that the pepper spray attack had been less of a challenge than many of the mental battles he fought with himself during long hours of ceremonial duty. The story of Margaret's attack and Thomas's response spread far beyond the tourist videos and news reports. It became a modern parable about the difference between entitled behavior and genuine character, between the power to harm others and the strength to remain unharmed by their actions. In a world increasingly defined by instant reactions and public outbursts, Thomas Mitchell had shown that the most powerful response to aggression could be no response at all. Years later, when asked about the incident in interviews, Thomas remained characteristically modest. "I was just doing my job," he would say. "The uniform represents something much larger than any individual, and my responsibility was to honor that regardless of what anyone else chose to do." His steel gaze, which had remained steady through one of the most unusual attacks in palace history, continued to embody the unwavering dignity of service to something greater than oneself.